33 royals. One impossible rule. Never appear weak. Behind crowns and coronations, behind oil portraits and public myths, lay bodies breaking in silence. Twisted spines, secret seizures, phantom heirs, and limbs that refused to obey. History painted them flawless. Reality was far stranger. This isn't the story of power. It's the story of what power had to hide. Welcome to the royal body double, where kings limped in silence, queens ruled from sickbeds, and the bloodline was anything but pure. This is 33 British royals who hid deformities and disabilities. And no, you were never supposed to know. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe. If you love untold history and quiet conspiracies, you're in the right place. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We want to know who's wandering these royal corridors with us. 1. Richard III. The bones were the first to speak. In 2012, beneath a Leicester parking lot, the remains of Richard III were unearthed. Coiled like a question mark, skull slumped sideways, spine curled into itself like a violin string pulled too tight. The discovery was a media sensation, but the real revelation wasn't where he'd been dumped, or the battlefield wounds carved into his bones. It was what his skeleton had been trying to hide in plain sight for over 5 centuries. A severe S-shaped scoliosis, twisting his spine by more than 70 degrees. This wasn't news to Shakespeare, of course. He had always painted Richard as a hunchback, a villain made villainous by deformity. But the truth was both simpler and stranger. Richard's condition had been actively concealed during his life, not exaggerated. He wore custom-tailored armor, specially designed to mask the asymmetry of his body. Painters flattered his posture. Chroniclers sidestepped his stature. And the myth of the twisted tyrant? That came later, when the Tudors needed a moral alibi for stealing his throne. In life, Richard had to walk a careful line. The 15th century was not kind to the visibly imperfect. Deformity was read as divine judgment, a sign of inner corruption. Power depended on projection, on appearing whole, composed, chosen. So Richard projected. He was a skilled horseman, an active commander in battle, and an administrator known for fairness, oddly enough. All of that had to be stage-managed to counterbalance one brutal biological fact, a spine that wouldn't behave. There are no records of him complaining. That in itself is a clue. Chronic pain, difficulty breathing, limited mobility, none of it surfaces in his letters or the accounts of courtiers, which means the suffering was hidden, endured, or simply omitted. Kings weren't supposed to limp. After Bosworth, the concealment deepened. His enemies needed him monstrous, body and soul. They didn't just bury the man, they buried the truth about his body. He was cast as a scheming imp, bent and bitter, crippled by both ambition and vertebrae. The irony? The real man spent his life hiding his condition. The legend made it the centerpiece. And yet, how could a king so physically marked by scoliosis rise in such a brutal world? The answer lies in what the skeleton couldn't show: control. Richard's entire life was performance. The limp, the armor, the propaganda, it all pointed to a singular truth. He understood how fragile the illusion of power could be. They say he cried, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," before dying on foot, alone, in a muddy field. No one knows if he actually said it. But the irony bites. For a man who spent his life hiding what made him stumble, it was the stumble that finally wrote his ending. But not his epilogue, because centuries later, his bones, stiff, silent, crooked, spoke louder than the myths ever could. Not a villain, not a hero, just a man who bent beneath a crown that never quite fit. And speaking of royal bodies that betrayed their keepers, let's look at a queen who lived with pain not from the spine, but from within the mind. A queen who wore her migraines like invisible thorns in a velvet crown. 2. Mary. Queen of Scots' power didn't kill Mary, Queen of Scots. Not directly. It merely made her suffering quieter. For much of her life, Mary ruled through chronic pain, debilitating migraines, violent enough to induce vomiting, sometimes lasting for days. She inherited them from her father, James V, whose reign ended early and badly. But Mary inherited more than just a headache. She also inherited the duty to pretend she wasn't suffering at all. In 16th century Scotland, a queen's body was not her own. It was a symbol, a statement, a source of dynastic capital. So when that body began to falter, when Mary's vision blurred, when her skull felt like it was cracking from within, there was no public acknowledgement. Only silence, closed doors, and a growing list of royal correspondence written by other hands while she lay curled in agony. The migraines began in her late teens and followed her through 3 marriages, a civil war, imprisonment, and eventual execution. In her letters, those not ghost-written, she hints at her malady, but the tone is always breezy, deferential, even apologetic, as if the pain itself were somehow impolite, as if queens weren't supposed to hurt. But the migraines weren't her only hidden companion. Mary was also plagued by rheumatism, which worsened as she aged. By the time she reached her 40s, her joints ached constantly. She spent long days unable to move without wincing, and even longer nights hiding it all beneath embroidered gowns and formal smiles. Why hide it? Because illness made you weak. And weakness, in a court of knives, was fatal. Even her enemies admitted she had charisma, an aura, a kind of doomed magnetism. That helped. Her beauty became a political weapon, her charm a distraction. But it also deepened the isolation. People saw what they wanted, a tragic queen, yes, but always regal, always radiant. No one wanted to picture the same woman doubled over in a stone chamber, pressing cold hands to her skull, whispering prayers not to faint during council. Physicians came and went. Some bled her, others prescribed mercury. None helped. But all were sworn to silence. Her ailments were state secrets, not because they were shameful, but because they were dangerous. And yet, despite all this, despite chronic pain, civil unrest, and diplomatic exile, Mary survived longer than most expected. She adapted. She learned when to speak, and more importantly, when to fake wellness. That talent, more than any crown, was what kept her alive as long as it did. Until it didn't. They executed her at age 44. History remembers the red dress, the martyr's performance, the severed head on the block. But the pain didn't start that day. It had been with her for decades, curled beneath her ribs, humming behind her eyes. And while Mary's migraines were hidden behind diplomacy and silk, the next royal in our chain of concealed suffering would face a different kind of affliction entirely, one that attacked, not the body, but the mind. One so dangerous, it had to be erased, redacted, and officially renamed. His name was George III, and they called him Mad. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of curious mind we made this for. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button to stay lost in the stories they tried to bury. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you drifting off in Dublin, or wide awake in Winnipeg at 3 a.m.? We're listening. 3. George III. They called him the Mad King, but madness is just a word people use when they don't understand what they're looking at. George III ruled longer than any monarch before him, 60 years on the throne. He lost the American colonies, survived assassination attempts, navigated global wars, and founded what many consider the modern British monarchy. But behind the powdered wigs, the calm blue portraits, and the clipped public addresses, something was wrong. Very wrong. For decades, he suffered from unpredictable and disturbing episodes, periods of mental disturbance that left courtiers alarmed, Parliament paralyzed, and the public unaware. Because every time George's mind betrayed him, his government scrambled to erase it. His first major breakdown came in 1788. He became talkative, uncontrollably so, rambling speeches stretched for hours. He spoke to trees as if they were ambassadors. His letters became frantic, obsessive, laced with underlinings and cryptic repetitions. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Then, almost suddenly, he collapsed into a state of incoherence so severe that he was restrained for his own safety. And yet, the official bulletins were strangely upbeat. "The king is slightly unwell," they'd say. "The king requires rest. The king's condition is improving." He wasn't improving. He was disintegrating. But to admit that a monarch, God's anointed, could slip into madness? That was unthinkable. A constitutional crisis wearing a crown. If the king was mad, who ruled? And if he couldn't rule, what was he? So the government bought silence. Servants were replaced. Doctors were sworn to secrecy. Doors were closed, windows curtained, letters intercepted. Ministers formed what amounted to a crisis PR machine. Filter the damage, control the narrative, protect the monarchy. And George? He was kept out of sight. Between episodes, he functioned, sometimes brilliantly. He was curious, moralistic, devoted to his wife and children. He founded the Royal Academy of Arts. He read everything. He asked difficult theological questions at dinner. He was, by many accounts, a good man. But when the illness returned, and it always returned, it hollowed him out. Modern historians suggest he may have suffered from porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause both physical pain and mental confusion. Others argue it was bipolar disorder or severe depression compounded by stress, isolation, and over-medication. Whatever it was, George knew it was happening. He wrote notes to himself in lucid periods, begging for clarity, apologizing for confusion, trying to document the slipping of his own mind, as if his memory could become its own witness. In time, his condition became impossible to hide. In 1811, Parliament passed the Regency Act, effectively handing power to his son. George lived 9 more years, blind, deaf, and completely out of touch with reality. He died in 1820, locked away in Windsor Castle. The people mourned a king they had not seen in years, but the damage was already done. The image of a mad king would define him forever. Not the legislation he passed, not the institutions he founded, just the whisper, the rumor, the madness. And yet, for all his suffering, George's story was never treated as a tragedy. It became theatrical, almost comical in retellings. A mad monarch wandering halls, a king who mistook trees for people. But beneath the caricature was a man fighting a battle with his own mind, while the world insisted he keep pretending nothing was wrong. His mind turned against him, and the kingdom pretended it hadn't noticed. Which brings us to his son. Because if George III was the monarch who unraveled in the shadows, then George IV was the one who decayed in public. A body swollen by indulgence, pain hidden beneath velvet, and a king too large for his own throne. 4. George IV. By the end of his life, George IV could no longer walk up a single flight of stairs without help. His legs had to be wrapped in linen bandages each morning. His fingers were so swollen that he stopped wearing rings. His eyes bulged from his head with the pressure of chronic gout, dropsy, and something that doctors only dared to call morbid corpulence. But his portraits? Slimmed, tapered, poised. This was a king whose image was quite literally repainted again and again to pretend that he wasn't falling apart. When George IV was young, still the Prince of Wales, he cut a dashing figure, fashionable, witty, theatrical. A man obsessed with clothes, architecture, and elaborate self-presentation. But even then, the cracks were forming. He drank heavily, ate excessively, and suffered his first attack of gout in his early 20s. Rather than slow down, he compensated with even more grandeur. His wardrobe exploded, his palaces expanded, his lifestyle inflated like a balloon just waiting for a match. By the time he was king, the effects were impossible to ignore. His weight had ballooned to over 20 stone, more than 280 pounds. He could no longer mount a horse without mechanical assistance. He bathed rarely, wore corsets to compress his stomach, and began avoiding public appearances altogether. But every time a new portrait was commissioned, the image was carefully doctored. Jowls vanished. Double chins retreated. Posture straightened. He became the first British monarch to rule entirely from a chair, and the throne, it turns out, had to be reinforced. Behind the walls of Windsor and Brighton, George lived in increasing physical agony. Gout ravaged his joints. Dropsy caused severe fluid retention in his legs and abdomen. He lived on a diet that only exacerbated his conditions: rich meats, claret, port, brandy, and enormous quantities of bread and cream. One observer described him, without malice, as a man buried alive in flesh. But the official line: the king is in good spirits. He merely requires rest. He required much more than rest. He needed help to stand. He rarely slept. He had his chambers modified so he could move around in a wheeled chair. And yet he remained obsessed with appearances, wearing extravagant robes, wigs, and jeweled sashes that barely fit around his girth. Every public appearance was a carefully managed illusion. A stiffened torso, a painted face, a smile that hid a mouthful of rotting teeth. And always, silence. No court bulletin ever mentioned the extent of his illness. There was no discussion of disability. His ministers and doctors colluded in a carefully orchestrated performance. The reality of the king's body, immobile, inflamed, distorted, was kept strictly off stage. Even in death, the illusion continued. When his body was laid out for viewing in 1830, it was heavily dressed, padded in certain areas, compressed in others. Witnesses were not allowed to linger. It was a strange kind of legacy. George IV became known not for his governance, which was minimal, but for his ability to stage manage his own decline. His real skill, it turned out, wasn't ruling, but disappearing. Hiding. Curating a version of himself that looked vaguely king-like, even as the real man could no longer walk, stand, or sleep without pain. But if George IV hid his body behind velvet and varnish, the next monarch in our descent into royal denial chose a very different tactic: concealment through transformation. Because when your face is scarred and your hair is gone, and your body refuses to look regal, you don't just cover it up. You become a symbol instead, which is precisely what Elizabeth I did. 5. Elizabeth I. By the end, she was more icon than woman. A floating face of alabaster, framed by fire-red wigs, drowning in ruffs, encased in gold thread and myth. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the light of a golden age, and underneath it all, a woman who had survived smallpox and paid for her survival in scars, hair loss, and chronic insecurity. In 1562, Elizabeth nearly died. Smallpox tore through her court, and when it reached her, it hit hard. For days, she was delirious, teetering on the edge of death, her attendants praying, her advisors already scheming over succession. Somehow, she survived. But the price was etched into her skin. Contemporaries noted that the Queen's face was never the same after that. She had been known for her complexion, milk and roses, they said. But now her cheeks were marred, pitted by scars. Her hair thinned, her eyebrows vanished. She was 29 years old, and the image that had been so carefully constructed, the radiant young queen, had shattered. So she rebuilt it. Not her skin, not her hair, but the illusion. Elizabeth leaned hard into cosmetics. Her signature look, chalk-white face paint, crimson lips, coal-black eyebrows, wasn't a fashion statement. It was a mask. The white paint, called Venetian ceruse, was a dangerous lead-based concoction. Toxic, yes, but effective. It hid the scars. It covered the truth. Portraits became propaganda. Artists weren't painting the woman. They were painting the idea. Commissions were rejected if they failed to capture her spirit. Wrinkles were smoothed, jowls vanished. Even as she aged into her 60s, her portraits refused to acknowledge it. She was frozen in time, face as stiff and untouched as porcelain. But the real Elizabeth was changing. Her teeth blackened. Her wigs became heavier, more elaborate, to compensate for what was underneath. Her hands trembled. Her eyesight faded. She began refusing mirrors. She banned any portraits that showed her aging. And in private she grew increasingly anxious, depressed, and suspicious of those around her. The court played along. Ministers flattered her appearance even as her makeup cracked in the heat. Ambassadors described her as radiant, while whispering letters back home describing her melancholy and restless spirit. She was never seen undressed, not even by her closest ladies. Dressing the queen was a public ritual, a daily performance of divinity. But beneath the lace and lead, there was skin, aging, scarred, fragile. And yet, she never publicly admitted weakness, not once. To be a woman ruling alone in a world of men was already a liability. To show physical frailty on top of that, unthinkable. Her body had to be transcendent, otherworldly, untouchable. So she turned herself into a living myth, one careful brushstroke at a time. But even myths have their limits. In her final years, Elizabeth began to decline. She suffered from insomnia. She stood for hours without speaking. She refused to lie down, fearing that if she did, she would never rise again. And in the end, she didn't. She died in 1603, sitting upright on cushions, surrounded by shadows, her mask still on. And still, even then, there was no official word of illness, no statement of scars or decline, only silence and legend. Elizabeth's body, like her reign, was built on control. She controlled what people saw, what they said, what they believed. She did not allow herself to be seen suffering because suffering was mortal, and she had long since decided that mortal was beneath her. But mortality runs in royal bloodlines, no matter how divine the makeup, and the next queen to sit upon the throne would know that all too well. Her name was Mary II, and she bore her scars not from politics or pressure, but from the same disease that marked her cousin. Only this time, the paint wasn't enough to make it disappear. 6. Mary II. She ruled during a revolution, but her body staged one of its own, quietly, invisibly beneath layers of silk and powder. Mary II is often remembered as half of a political pair. William and Mary, Protestant saviors of England, deliverers of the glorious Revolution. But what tends to be left out, shaved off the edges of the portrait, edited out of the legacy, is that Mary carried the physical legacy of smallpox, just like her cousin Elizabeth before her. The disease nearly killed her. It left her scarred, permanently, across her face and body. But unlike Elizabeth, who cloaked herself in myth and metaphor, Mary hid her disfigurement behind something more mundane: manners. Born into the House of Stuart in 1662, Mary was groomed to be politically useful, not personally noticed. She was tall, striking, and dutiful, qualities that made her a perfect bride for William of Orange, the man her uncle, Charles II, handpicked for Protestant stability. When she married and moved to the Netherlands, she did so without protest. When she was called back to rule jointly with William after the deposition of her Catholic father, James II, she accepted the crown with grace and formality. But privately, her body was marked. Mary contracted smallpox in 1692, well into her reign. It was a near-fatal case. For days, she hovered at the edge of death, while the court tiptoed around the possibility of another succession crisis. When she finally emerged from her sickbed, the disease had done its damage, deep scarring, particularly across her face. One observer described her complexion, delicately, as marred by the hand of Providence. But the court didn't speak of it, not officially, not publicly, In portraits commissioned after her illness, her skin appears smooth, untouched, flawless. The artists knew better, of course, but they also knew their audience. Queens weren't supposed to suffer, and if they did, it was supposed to look poetic, not physical. So Mary adjusted. She leaned into elegance. She wore face powder, yes, but not the theatrical masks of Elizabeth's era. Instead, she favored restraint. Pale shades, subdued colors, a kind of deliberate visual understatement that drew attention away from what wasn't meant to be noticed. And people noticed, just not the scars. She immersed herself in piety and charity. She gave generously to hospitals and poorhouses. She avoided excess. In a court still drunk on Restoration hedonism, Mary projected humility. It was both a religious conviction and a personal strategy. If you can't erase the scars, you can at least outshine them. But her body wasn't finished with betrayal. After surviving smallpox, Mary's health remained precarious. She complained of recurring fevers, joint pain, and exhaustion. These were not grand, visible ailments, just the kind that wear down a life from the inside. She soldiered on, as queens were trained to do, holding court, attending church, signing laws. But the court knew. Her physicians knew. William knew. In 1694, she caught what was initially called a cold. It developed into a virulent form of pneumonia, and this time there was no recovery. She died at just 32 years old, after 9 years on the throne. William, usually stern and emotionally distant, reportedly wept openly. The nation mourned. Sermons compared her to saints. Her purity, her composure, her dutiful spirit, these became the narrative. What didn't make it into the sermons? The scars, the pain, the sense that Mary's body had, like so many royal bodies before her, been forced into silence. And silence, as always, makes room for myth. But while Mary was quietly erased beneath layers of powdered decorum, her successor, James I, took a different approach. He didn't hide in portraits. He didn't vanish behind cosmetics. He faced the world with a limp, a tremor, and a speech impediment, and ruled anyway, though not without rewriting a few royal rules along the way. 7. James Way. James VI of Scotland. He limped when he walked. His hands trembled. He spoke in a stuttered rhythm, halting and hesitant, as if the words didn't quite belong to him. This was James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, the man who united two crowns, commissioned a Bible, survived the gunpowder plot, and became the living embodiment of divine right monarchy. And yet, in private moments and careful accounts, you'll find hints of a king whose body refused to match the authority of his title. James was born in 1566 under circumstances already marked by instability. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate when he was just 1 year old. He never saw her again. Raised by regents in a series of cold Scottish castles, James grew up isolated, bookish, and strangely frail. Reports from his early years describe weak legs, a slight twisting of the spine, and trouble walking long distances without tiring. As he aged, his walk developed into a noticeable limp, and his body remained thin, uneven, and ungraceful. He also suffered from a pronounced speech impediment, likely a stammer, that grew more obvious during times of stress. In public speeches, James often relied on notes, pre-written texts, or even stand-ins. When he had to speak extemporaneously, observers noted the disjointed cadence and muddled clarity of his voice. At court, jesters and pamphleteers would later satirize him, exaggerating his odd gait and anxious mannerisms. But during his reign, these characteristics were handled delicately, because while it was one thing to have a peculiar courtier, it was quite another to have a king whose body seemed to betray him. He also experienced nervous tics, including facial twitches and rapid blinking. Some modern scholars have speculated he may have had a neurological condition, possibly Tourette's, or a mild form of cerebral palsy. But in his time, no diagnosis existed. There was only judgment. And so James, like so many royals before him, learned to manage his own image, not through illusion or silence, but through relentless intellect. He compensated, ruthlessly. James read constantly, wrote obsessively, and debated furiously. He published books, Demonology, Basilicon Doron, The True Law of Free Monarchies, using scholarship as armor. He believed that kings were God's lieutenants on earth, and he insisted that his authority came not from popularity or presentation, but from divine ordination. In other words, his body didn't have to be perfect because his soul was chosen. And yet, he remained deeply self-conscious. When portraits were commissioned, artists were told to idealize his figure. His asymmetrical shoulders were softened, his face smoothed, his eyes enlarged. One painter added a full 6 inches to his height in an official coronation canvas. He wasn't fooled, but he allowed the illusion to exist, for the sake of the crown. At court, he surrounded himself with loyal favorites. Most famously, the Duke of Buckingham, whose presence may have helped draw attention away from James's own physical awkwardness. The king's emotional reliance on these companions became political fodder, but he didn't seem to care. In private letters, he referred to himself as an old, feeble body in a young world, yet continued to rule with a tenacity that defied expectation. In many ways, James was the prototype for how to rule while visibly flawed. He did not hide his limp. He did not suppress his stutter. He ruled not as a figure of physical perfection, but as a monarch who insisted his mind was enough. And for a time, it was. But what happens when neither mind nor body can hold the line? When illness isn't episodic or manageable but total? When the monarch ceases to speak, to move, to even recognize the throne? That was the tragic reality of Henry VI, a king who sat on the throne while utterly absent, a royal shell moved by others while the world burned around him. 8. Henry VI. He ruled England, but only sometimes. Henry VI's reign was not so much a story of power as it was a prolonged disappearance. Not because he abdicated or vanished into exile, but because his mind, quite simply, left him. Not once, not briefly, but in long, terrifying silences that no one dared name for what they were. Born in 1421, Henry inherited the throne at just 9 months old after the death of his father, Henry V, England's warrior king and national hero. From the start, Henry was the wrong kind of monarch for a war-torn age. Soft-spoken, passive, devoutly religious, and more interested in church building than military conquest, he was described by contemporaries as a lamb among wolves. But the real tragedy didn't begin with personality. It began when he stopped speaking altogether. In 1453, ironically, the same year Constantinople fell and the medieval world officially tilted, Henry experienced what physicians would later call a catatonic stupor. For over a year, the King of England said nothing, responded to no one, and showed no sign that he recognized his court, his wife, or even the birth of his own son. He simply vanished inward. There was no royal decree to explain it. No proclamation. Just whispers. A king who blinked but didn't answer. Who breathed but didn't rule. And this wasn't a one-time event. Henry's mental collapses, which modern scholars believe could have been episodes of catatonic schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, or a genetic psychiatric illness, recurred throughout his life. His rule became a fractured timeline, punctuated by vacant stares and long silences. Regency councils filled the vacuum. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, took control of the court. Nobles fought for influence, and the Wars of the Roses began to gather in the wings. Yet still, the fiction of his kingship had to be maintained. Chroniclers at the time struggled with how to describe what they were witnessing. They avoided terms like madness, instead using phrases like, The king is troubled, or has fallen into heaviness. Physicians offered prayers, herbal remedies, bloodletting. Nothing worked. And the more England needed a leader, the more conspicuously absent Henry became. At times he would return, abruptly, as if waking from a deep sleep. He'd ask questions, smile, speak softly. He would rule for a time, sign documents, hold court, and then drift away again, like a tide going out. His reign became a kind of ghost story. The king was here, and then he wasn't. But make no mistake, this was not a private illness. The entire kingdom was forced to pretend their sovereign was present when he wasn't. Royal proclamations were issued in his name. Battles were fought. Allegiances shifted. And all the while, the man at the center of the storm sat in silence, head bowed, lost in a world no one could enter. Portraits of Henry VI are oddly placid. He appears youthful, monkish, almost saint-like. They don't show a man crippled by mental instability. They show a holy figure, pious and serene. That was the official story, that Henry was more suited to prayer than politics, more monk than monarch. Convenient, harmless, and utterly misleading. Behind the myth was a country descending into chaos. The Wars of the Roses weren't just about dynastic rivalry. They were about a throne left vacant by a king who physically occupied it but could not wield it. When Edward IV seized power, Henry was captured, deposed, restored, and then deposed again. He died in the Tower of London in 1471, likely murdered. But by then, the man had been gone for years. He was a king whose absence defined his legacy, whose crown sat not on his head, but in the hands of others. And perhaps that was the most dangerous deformity of all, not a twisted limb or fragile heart, but the inability to perform the one task expected of a monarch: to be there. But while Henry VI faded into the background, the next king did the opposite. He exploded into history, larger than life, thundering through tournaments, wars, and wives. Yet beneath the velvet and violence, Henry VIII carried a body slowly rotting from within, hidden behind armor, titles, and thrones. 9. Henry VIII. He entered history on horseback. Broad-shouldered, golden-haired, athletic. The kind of prince Renaissance Europe envied. The kind of king England hadn't seen before. Henry VIII, heir to the Tudors, defender of the faith, master of 6 marriages and 1,000 myths. But he didn't end that way. By the time of his death in 1547, he could barely walk. His once celebrated legs were wrapped in bandages, oozing from chronic ulcers that would not heal. His mood had soured into something cold and explosive, and his court, once built on displays of strength, jousts, hunting, music, had become a tight-lipped circle of handlers trying to keep the truth away from public view, that the most powerful man in England was no longer whole. It started with a fall. In 1536, Henry was thrown from his horse while jousting, an accident serious enough to knock him unconscious for 2 hours. He was 44 years old, and though he recovered, something shifted. The leg wounds he sustained never fully healed. What followed were decades of pain, infection, and restricted movement, all carefully masked by thrones, flowing robes, and a royal image machinery already well practiced in the art of concealment. Those ulcers, stinking, suppurating, stubborn, became the king's constant companions. Courtiers noted how his legs had to be wrapped daily, how he could no longer mount a horse without assistance, how his temper darkened as his body slowed. But none of this made it into proclamations or portraits. Instead, the illusion held. Official likenesses showed a man still upright, broad-chested, domineering. He stared down from canvases with a fixed expression of ruthless certainty. No one painted the padded chairs he needed to support himself during audiences. No one captured the shuffle behind the ceremonial walk. And then there was his size. Henry VIII's obesity in later years is widely documented by observers, diplomats, even his own tailors. His waistline ballooned. His armor had to be refitted multiple times until finally it could no longer be worn at all. He became breathless after minimal exertion, reportedly sweating heavily through layers of velvet and fur. But still, no admission of decline. When foreign ambassadors sent home coded letters about the king's health, they did so carefully, noting, "The king appears less mobile," or somewhat short of breath. Euphemisms. Because telling the truth about a monarch's body was dangerous. It suggested vulnerability. And vulnerability invited ambition, from enemies within and beyond the realm. So Henry's court doubled down. His presence was amplified, even as his mobility shrank. When he could no longer walk through palace halls, others walked for him. Ceremonies were adjusted, thrones were elevated, speeches were read on his behalf. The machinery of monarchy moved with him, slowly, creaking, but still projecting power. Privately, he became increasingly paranoid, isolating himself from all but a few trusted attendants. The pain from his legs was constant. He lashed out at those who displeased him, including wives and advisors. Some historians argue that his mood swings and erratic decisions in later life, executions, reforms, religious turnarounds, were not just political whims, but symptoms of chronic pain, compounded by infection and perhaps even undiagnosed complications from his head injury years earlier. But no one ever called the king disabled. Not to his face, not in writing. Instead, his ailments were either denied, downplayed, or spiritualized. Some claimed his suffering was divine punishment for breaking from Rome. Others whispered it was God testing a righteous ruler. And then one day, the king simply stopped appearing altogether. In his final weeks, his mobility was gone. His ulcers worsened. His body swelled with fluid. He held no audiences, issued no edicts. The voice of the once great monarch fell silent behind closed doors until the official announcement of his death was made, clean and simple. The king had passed. No mention of the stink, the agony, the decades of hidden decline. Just a name, a date, and silence. But while Henry's body broke slowly, with all the resources of a kingdom trying to hide it, his successor would face a more immediate kind of struggle, one that defined every day of her reign. Queen Anne didn't just manage illness. She governed from within it. 10. Queen Anne. They called her Brandy Nan behind her back, an insult wrapped in ridicule, as court gossip often is. But Queen Anne wasn't drunk. She was in pain, constantly, cripplingly, in ways that made the crown feel less like a symbol of majesty and more like a punishment quietly pressing down on her spine. Anne was not born to be queen. She was born the spare, second daughter of James II, and lived most of her early life in the shadows of court hierarchy. But when her Protestant faith became politically useful and her Catholic father was pushed from the throne in the Glorious Revolution, Anne's position shifted sharply. She eventually became queen in 1702, the first monarch of a united Great Britain. By then, she was already broken. Her body, once hopeful and full of promise, had turned on her early. Anne suffered from chronic inflammatory illnesses, likely a form of rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, though the exact diagnosis remains unclear. What is certain is the impact: swelling in her joints, debilitating pain, and rapidly decreasing mobility. As early as her 30s, she struggled to walk unaided. By her 40s, she was entirely dependent on wheelchairs, though the word wheelchair was never used in royal documents. It was always the Queen's sedan, or her portable chair, because disability was not a category that could coexist with sovereignty. Even in pain, Anne continued to rule. She held daily meetings with ministers, signed treaties, navigated wars, and wrangled an ever-shifting parliament. But her court was engineered to hide the scale of her suffering. Her public appearances were carefully staged. She was lifted onto thrones and into carriages behind closed curtains. Her swollen legs were wrapped in layers of fabric. Her gowns were tailored to hide the stiffness in her arms. Her throne was modified. built taller, wider, padded, to allow her to appear upright despite the pain. Contemporaries whispered about her gout, but what they meant was everything. The swelling, the stiffness, the weight gain, the fatigue. Anne's body bloated, likely from both her illness and the endless parade of treatments, bloodletting, purging, mercury-based tonics, that did more harm than good. Her face puffed, her hands curled, her gait vanished entirely. Still, no royal proclamation ever mentioned illness. She was simply indisposed, fatigued, requiring privacy. But perhaps the most tragic and heavily managed part of Anne's physical suffering was her reproductive history. She was pregnant at least 17 times. 17. Of those pregnancies, none resulted in a child who survived into adulthood. Her body delivered stillbirths, suffered miscarriages, and mourned infants lost days or weeks after birth. The emotional toll was staggering. The political toll was worse. An heir was expected. A legacy was required. And so each failed pregnancy was wrapped in silence and statecraft. The court celebrated her conceptions, held its breath during her labors, and then fell quiet when the nursery stayed empty. Again and again and again. Anne internalized this silence. In her personal letters, she expressed grief with remarkable restraint. She blamed herself. She prayed. She kept going. Despite everything, her pain, her losses, her isolation, she ruled for over a decade. During that time, Britain transformed. The two kingdoms became one. The War of the Spanish Succession altered Europe, and parliamentary power grew in ways the monarchy would never fully reclaim. And through it all, Anne remained physically present, even when she could barely move. She died in 1714 at age 49, after a long and painful decline. The autopsy described a body overwhelmed by dropsy, her organs failing, her limbs distended. But again, that wasn't what the public was told. Officially, she had died peacefully, a final euphemism, in a life thick with them. Queen Anne was many things: devout, stubborn, politically cautious. But perhaps more than anything, she was a woman who governed from inside a cage of pain, making decisions with swollen fingers, sitting atop a throne that hurt to touch. And yet, her voice never wavered. But the next king's voice did. Literally. Because George VI, 2 centuries later, would inherit not illness of the limbs, but of speech. And in a world now shaped by radio, microphones, and recorded addresses, his stammer couldn't be hidden behind curtains. It had to be defeated or edited out. 11. George VI. When your job is to speak for a nation, a stammer becomes more than a personal affliction. It becomes a constitutional crisis. George VI never wanted the throne. That fact is etched into every photograph of him in those early years. The stiff shoulders, the wary eyes, the slightly defensive tilt of the head. He was born the second son, comfortably hidden behind the future Edward VIII, a spare in every sense. But when Edward abdicated in 1936 for love, or scandal depending on who's telling the story, the crown fell onto George's head like a thunderclap. And suddenly the man who could barely get through a sentence was expected to speak for the entire British Empire. George's stammer had followed him since childhood. It was more than a mere hesitation. It was deep, unpredictable, and often agonizing. The words would back up in his throat, locked behind his jaw, forcing pauses so long they felt like silences. He knew it, and so did everyone else. At court, aides learned to look away politely during these moments. In private life, family members encouraged him to avoid public speaking altogether. But now he was king. A king in the age of radio, when monarchs no longer ruled by decree, but by voice. Broadcast into homes, heard across continents, dissected in newspapers the next morning. A king whose every word could calm or provoke, steady or shake. So the monarchy did what it always does in crisis. It controlled the optics. George began intensive work with speech therapists, most famously Lionel Logue, the Australian whose unorthodox methods would later be immortalized in film. But what the movies often skip is how desperate the real situation was. George wasn't just trying to sound polished, he was trying to survive the role, to prove to the government, to the world, and perhaps most cruelly, to himself, that he wasn't broken. He practiced for hours. He rehearsed each speech dozens of times, breaking them down syllable by syllable. He marked scripts with pauses, emphasized rhythm, and employed techniques like controlled breathing and pacing. But even with all this, the stammer didn't disappear. It simply became invisible to the public. Why? Because palace officials and the BBC developed a system of careful edits and retakes. When a royal broadcast was recorded, engineers would cut around his stumbles. Speeches were sometimes stitched together from multiple takes. Live addresses were minimized. And when they were necessary, George rehearsed to the point of exhaustion. Everything was orchestrated to create the impression of fluency, composure, command. Behind the curtain, it was a different story. He hated speaking. He dreaded ceremonial events. He would become physically tense before every engagement, his hands trembling, his jaw clenched. His wife, Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, stood by him constantly, offering quiet support, subtle signals, calming presence. Yet despite it all, he became deeply beloved. Precisely because people knew, or at least suspected, that his strength came from struggle. During World War II, as bombs fell over London, George refused to leave the city. He visited bombed-out neighborhoods. He addressed the nation. And yes, sometimes, he stammered. But the people leaned in closer, not away. Because here was a man clearly battling something inside himself and doing it anyway. That quiet perseverance became the cornerstone of his image. Not power, not charisma, but dignity through difficulty. A monarch who didn't rise above struggle, but ruled within it. He died in 1952, aged only 56, exhausted by years of stress and heavy smoking, which had brought on lung disease and heart complications. But his voice, edited though it was, had already become part of Britain's collective memory. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. Because every word you heard had been hard-won. But if George VI ruled with a shaky voice, the next royal in our descent into concealed frailty had once ruled with a fragile body, and a childhood marked by weakness, both physical and political. A monarch who mastered his own disabilities just in time to lose his head. Charles I was never supposed to be strong, but strength, in his case, would become a matter of performance, right until the very end. 12. Charles I. History remembers Charles I for how he died. Stoic, silent, kneeling before the blade. But long before that final, chilling image, Charles was defined by silence of a different kind. The kind imposed by a body that struggled to perform power in a world obsessed with appearances. As a child, Charles was considered weak, not metaphorically, physically. Born the second son of James III and Anne of Denmark, he was sickly from birth. His early years were marked by poor coordination, slow development, and a speech impediment that made even basic conversation a source of dread. He stammered. He paused unpredictably. He would seize up mid-sentence and blink in frustration, searching for words he knew but couldn't release. And then there were his legs. Contemporaries describe young Charles as delicate and unsteady. He struggled to walk without support. Some accounts suggest a form of muscle weakness or congenital joint instability. Whatever the root cause, the result was clear. The boy who would become king limped, physically and socially, through the royal court. His parents tried to shield him. Tutors were brought in to train his voice. Exercises were designed to strengthen his limbs. He was made to practice speeches alone for hours, walk in long corridors, and ride horses with specially built saddles to compensate for balance issues. His early education was not just academic, it was rehabilitative, a crash course in becoming visually acceptable. By the time his older brother Henry died and Charles became heir, the pressure tripled. A prince could be quiet. A king could not be weak. So Charles cultivated silence, not of absence, but of control. He learned to speak slowly, deliberately. The stammer never vanished, but it was disguised, smoothed by formality, hidden behind protocol. His limp became less visible as his movements were staged, his appearances carefully orchestrated, his public exposure limited. He developed a love of ceremony, structure, and control. Not coincidentally, his reign would be marked by rigid absolutism, constitutional crises, and escalating conflict with Parliament. To Charles, order was not optional. It was survival. His body had taught him that. His childhood frailty had carved a deep need for dignity, for invulnerability, for stillness. Ironically, it was that same rigidity that led to his downfall. Refusing compromise, he was eventually captured, tried, and executed. But when the moment came, on a bitter January morning in 1649, Charles stood tall, walked without stumbling, spoke without faltering. The limp and the stammer were gone, at least for that hour. To many, that final composure made him a martyr. To others, it was a tragic irony, a king who spent his life hiding his body and who became immortal only by losing it. But before Charles lost his crown, another monarch had learned how to lose breath itself, William III, who ruled with authority even as his lungs betrayed him, coughing in private while commanding in public. 13. William III. William III was never built for public affection. Cold, reserved, austere, he ruled from a distance, both emotionally and physically. But behind that chilly exterior was a constant, wheezing companion. A lifelong battle with asthma, a condition that shaped not just his health, but his entire approach to monarchy. Born in The Hague and shaped by war, William arrived in England in 1688 with a sword in one hand and a declaration of constitutional monarchy in the other. He came not to charm, but to conquer. Still, he needed to project strength. And asthma, visible, audible, disruptive, was anything but regal. From his youth, William struggled to breathe, not just in winter or when ill, but unpredictably. His attacks could come in the middle of a conversation, a diplomatic meeting, a procession. Wheezing, coughing, shortness of breath, these weren't occasional inconveniences. They were chronic and often debilitating. Several contemporary sources, including his own physicians, noted how pale and drawn he often looked. His eyes sunken, his posture stiff. He moved like someone trying to conserve oxygen. But none of this made it to the stage. William understood optics. A foreign king newly installed on the English throne couldn't afford to appear frail. So, the coughing fits were managed in private. Court routines were adjusted to accommodate rest without explanation. Public events were shortened or delayed under vague pretenses. Bad weather, political matters, ceremonial conflicts. When in pain or breathless, William simply retreated. And when retreat wasn't possible, he endured in silence. He spoke little. His voice was low and monotone, not from disinterest, but likely from effort. Speaking for long periods exhausted him. His ministers learned to interpret nods, brief comments, and subtle expressions. They filled the silences he left behind. Over time, William's taciturn nature became part of his myth. Not weakness, but stoic authority. Even his military campaigns were shaped by the limits of his lungs. He traveled with doctors and tonics. His tents were aired out obsessively. At night, attendants monitored his breathing. Despite all this, he remained active in battle longer than many expected, pushing his body through the demands of leadership while his chest fought for every breath. He never asked for pity. He didn't have the luxury. His wife, Mary II, helped carry the weight of rule, especially during the early years. But after her death in 1694, William stood alone, physically deteriorating, politically embattled, and still expected to embody the strength of two nations. He died in 1702 after falling from a horse, his lungs weakened, his body frail. But his legacy endured. The Glorious Revolution, the Bill of Rights, the Protestant succession. A king who shaped modern Britain between shallow breaths, and whose silences spoke louder than his wheezing ever did. And yet, even William's carefully hidden breathlessness pales next to the next royal on our path. A princess born to an empire, sculpted into perfection, yet quietly marked by a hidden twist in her spine. Her name was Victoria, but not the queen. Her daughter, the empress who never stood quite straight. 14. Victoria, Princess Royal. She was her mother's favorite, the firstborn of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and a political experiment wrapped in royal lace. Victoria, Princess Royal, was raised not just as a child, but as a symbol of dynasty, diplomacy, and Victorian perfection. Groomed to become an empress, a wife, a beacon of British virtue transplanted to the German states, and for the most part she played the role seamlessly. Intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, politically astute, and artistically gifted. But behind the poised figure in every portrait was a hidden physical flaw, a spinal or shoulder deformity, subtle yet undeniable, the result of a birth injury or early developmental issue that left her permanently asymmetrical. It was not pronounced, not dramatic, not something that required a cane or wheelchair. But it was enough. Enough for doctors to take note, enough for court seamstresses to learn which angles worked best for camera and canvas. Enough that her mother, who had built her identity on emotional repression and ironclad decorum, noticed immediately and never stopped correcting. Queen Victoria, in her letters, expressed thinly veiled frustration. She referred to her daughter's posture with words like awkward, ungraceful, or unbecoming. She demanded constant improvements, tighter corsets, straighter shoulders, more discipline. She urged Prince Albert to oversee posture exercises and riding lessons. It was all framed as preparation for public life, but the subtext was clear. Imperfection would not be tolerated. And so Victoria, the daughter, learned to hide. She mastered the visual performance of symmetry, chin high, eyes level, shoulders balanced, even when her body pulled slightly off center. She stood for portraits with practiced angles. Artists, of course, painted what was expected, not what was real. In formal images, her figure appears upright, her stance composed. But informal sketches hint at a curve, a slight drop in one shoulder, a turn that suggests constraint rather than grace. When she married Frederick, Crown Prince of Prussia, and moved to Berlin, she carried her secret with her. Among the stiff formality of the Prussian court, appearance mattered more than ever. She wore layers of structured fabric, rigid corsetry, and high collars, not simply for fashion, but to compensate. Her discomfort was buried beneath velvet and duty. Still, whispers persisted. Her critics in Germany, who resented her British liberalism, sometimes seized on her strangeness, her posture, her perceived stiffness, and used it to question her strength, her femininity, even her loyalty. All while she mothered 8 children, including the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, who himself would be born with a withered arm, another physical flaw the family would attempt unsuccessfully to manage and disguise. Victoria never publicly acknowledged her condition. She didn't need to. She spent her life performing around it. Her body was bent, but her resolve was not. And while her hidden curvature was veiled in layers of fabric and formality, her mother, Queen Victoria herself, carried a genetic secret far more dangerous. One not seen, but inherited. One that would silently ripple through the bloodlines of Europe and bring empires to their knees. 15. Queen Victoria. She was the grandmother of Europe, the iron-willed widow in black, the monarch whose reign defined an entire era. But Queen Victoria, so famously unyielding in temperament, carried within her something far more fragile, a genetic mutation that would haunt generations of royals. Not a visible affliction, not something whispered in drawing rooms or scrawled in the margins of court diaries, but a silent passenger in her blood, hemophilia. Victoria herself never suffered the symptoms, but she was almost certainly a carrier of the condition, a mutation likely originating with her, since no known trace exists in previous generations. Hemophilia, a rare disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly, is inherited in an X-linked pattern. A woman can carry it silently. A man, if he inherits it, bleeds without end. Bruises swell. Cuts linger. Joints fill with blood after the smallest injury. In the 19th century, before modern treatment, it was often a death sentence. For a commoner, this would be a tragedy. For a royal family, it was a dynastic crisis. Victoria passed the gene to at least 3 of her 9 children. One of them, Prince Leopold, would be diagnosed outright. Several of her daughters became carriers, seeding the condition into the royal houses of Russia, Spain, and Prussia. Yet the existence of the disease was treated with absolute secrecy, not because it was shameful, but because it was politically explosive. A monarch was meant to symbolize stability, continuity, divine selection. Hemophilia did the opposite. It revealed frailty. It threatened succession. It meant heirs could die from a stumble. For a royal house, that kind of vulnerability wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Victoria never spoke publicly about it. Her letters make oblique references to Leopold's delicate constitution, his bleeding fits, his troublesome joints. There are hints of guilt, too, brief, defensive comments about how one cannot be blamed for accidents of inheritance. But even in private, she refused to dwell on it. The issue was not just medical, it was political, reputational, existential. Portraits of her children show them rosy-cheeked and healthy. Official biographies gloss over lingering illnesses. And still, the blood told its own story. When Leopold bruised too easily, his staff blamed the weather. When Russian Tsarevich Alexei, her great-grandson, collapsed from minor injuries, the Russian court buried it beneath layers of mysticism and denial. Victoria lived to see the consequences. She watched as her descendants married into foreign courts, unknowingly spreading the condition. She saw the complications, the injuries, the quiet deaths. But she never acknowledged the thread connecting them all. She ruled for 63 years, unshakable, unapologetic. But beneath her crown flowed a genetic legacy more lasting than any empire. And from that legacy came her son, Prince Leopold, the most fragile of her children. A prince whose every bruise was a threat, whose body was treated like glass, and whose life would become a study in how to survive when your very blood refuses to stop. 16. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. He was born a prince raised as a question. From the beginning, Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's youngest son, was different, not in temperament, but in constitution. Where his brothers rode, hunted, and trained for war, Leopold watched from the sidelines, not out of choice, but out of necessity. His body, from the very start, simply wouldn't cooperate. By the age of 3, the symptoms were impossible to ignore. Small bumps led to large bruises. Minor cuts refused to clot. He would wake with painful, swollen joints, his knees and ankles visibly distended, sometimes unable to bear weight for days. It was the signature curse of hemophilia, the blood disorder his mother had unknowingly passed down to him. But while others could afford to acknowledge illness, royalty had only one acceptable posture: strength. So the diagnosis was never officially named in public, not once. In private, the royal household whispered of his condition, his delicacy, his fragility. Servants were instructed not to speak of his injuries. His tutors were trained to accommodate his limitations without drawing attention to them. Even his mother, Queen Victoria, who adored him, refused to let illness define him. He must have a full life, she insisted, not a sick-room existence. And so Leopold tried, desperately. He was bright, arguably the most intellectually gifted of Victoria's sons. He attended Oxford, studied the classics, befriended artists, writers, scientists. He loved poetry and philosophy. But behind the scholarly charm was a boy raised in a palace of caution. Every outing was measured, every activity calculated. The royal physicians became a permanent presence, always nearby, always watching. His condition wasn't just physical, it was political. An heir who could bleed to death from a slip on the stairs posed a dynastic risk. Marriage, succession, even basic public appearances had to be negotiated around his health. His family debated whether he should marry at all, fearing the disease might be passed on. Leopold pushed back. He wanted more than his sick room. He wanted a life. Eventually, he married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Their union was happy but brief. They had 2 children, one of whom, Alice, would become a carrier herself, ensuring the disease continued its quiet march through European royalty. In 1884, while traveling in Cannes, Leopold slipped and fell. The injury wasn't major by most standards. But for him, it was fatal. Internal bleeding set in. There was no cure, no treatment. He died at just 30 years old. The press mourned him as a scholar prince, a gentle soul. But the full truth of his condition remained veiled. Not out of shame, out of strategy. The British royal family had no room for weakness that might threaten its image of permanence. And yet, the same genetic burden that took Leopold would quietly mark his sisters. Princess Alice of Hesse, bright, devout, politically active, would carry the same silent code, pass it on, and see the consequences ripple into revolution. 17. Princess Alice of Hesse. She was the 3rd child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, a daughter born into the disciplined warmth of a court that prized duty over sentiment. Princess Alice was clever, introspective, and deeply compassionate, perhaps the most emotionally intelligent of Victoria's children. She grew into a devoted wife, a hands-on mother, and an early adopter of modern nursing methods long before such things were considered royal behavior. But beneath her soft demeanor and progressive values, Alice carried something far more treacherous than idealism. She was a carrier of hemophilia. The mutation passed from her mother to her, and from her to her son. But at the time of Alice's life, this chain of transmission was invisible. Genetics wasn't yet understood. The science of inheritance was in its infancy. What the royal family knew was simply this. Alice's male child was sick, and no one could explain why. Her son, Friedrich, called Fritty, was born in 1870. He was bright, cheerful, and adored. But within his first year, bruises began appearing without cause. A small bump to the head would swell for days. Minor cuts wouldn't close. Alice, who had grown up with the euphemisms and evasions of court language, recognized the pattern instantly. Her little boy had the same condition that had plagued her brother Leopold. And just like that, the shadow fell across another branch of the family tree. Fritty's hemophilia was not public knowledge. The court kept it quiet. The German press made no mention. Alice herself confided only in trusted friends and family. But in her letters, the strain is evident. She writes with a careful optimism that reads more like emotional triage. She knows what's coming. It came in 1873. While playing in a room with an open window, Fritty fell a short distance, less than a few feet. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a harmless tumble. But for a hemophiliac child, the injury triggered internal bleeding that doctors could not stop. Alice held him for hours, helpless, knowing exactly what was happening and exactly how it would end. He died at just 2 years old. The official cause of death was listed simply as injury. No mention of blood, no mention of disease, only silence. Alice never recovered. She continued her charitable work, founded nursing programs, and cared for her remaining children, But a part of her withdrew. She became more private, more solemn. And just 5 years later, during a diphtheria outbreak in her household, she succumbed to the illness herself at the age of 35, exhausted, bereaved, and largely forgotten by a monarchy that never quite knew what to do with women who didn't fit the narrative. But Alice had passed on more than her values. She had passed on the gene to her daughter Alex, better known to history as Alexandra, Empress of Russia. And while Alice's sorrow was private, her sister Beatrice's legacy would become a hidden pipeline for hemophilia, stretching quietly into the next generation. 18. Princess Beatrice. By the time Princess Beatrice was born in 1857, Queen Victoria had buried her beloved Prince Albert and retreated into a fortress of black crape and ritual mourning. Beatrice, the youngest of 9 children, became her mother's shadow. A quiet child, a companion, and eventually a caretaker. But what Victoria didn't or wouldn't say was that her daughter had inherited something else, something far less visible than duty, the same hemophilia-carrying gene that had already altered the course of their family's future. Beatrice was not ill herself. Like her sister Alice and her mother before her, she was a carrier. She lived with no symptoms, no outward sign that anything in her blood might be dangerous. But as always, the danger was reserved for the next generation. For decades, Beatrice was discouraged from marrying. Queen Victoria, fiercely dependent on her youngest child for emotional support, had no intention of letting her go. It wasn't until Beatrice was well into her 20s that she secretly began a romance with Prince Henry of Battenberg. The Queen eventually gave in, grudgingly, but only on the condition that the couple live with her. Even in marriage, Beatrice remained within reach. She had 4 children. 2 of her sons, Leopold and Maurice, would inherit hemophilia. The name was familiar by then. The condition had already taken her brother Leopold, her nephew Fritti, and begun its quiet work in other corners of Europe. But now it returned to Beatrice's own home. Still, the pattern continued: silence, euphemism, and concealment. The condition was never named in official court records. Leopold's frequent injuries were described as delicate health. Maurice, who died in World War I, was memorialized as a soldier and a hero, his condition omitted entirely from public memory. Beatrice, like her mother, maintained the careful fiction that the royal body, though occasionally prone to melancholy or fatigue, remained fundamentally strong. But within the family, there was no such illusion. Beatrice lived in quiet anxiety. Her letters reveal a woman both loving and deeply aware of the fragility she had passed on. She outlived 3 of her 4 children, and although she rarely spoke about the hemophilia that shaped so much of their lives, the pattern continued to haunt the bloodlines of her descendants, rippling outward through the Battenbergs and into the broader tapestry of European nobility. She died in 1944, at the age of 87, one of the last surviving children of Queen Victoria, and the final link in a genetic chain that had reshaped dynasties. Her legacy, like her life, was understated. No scandal, no rebellion, just the quiet transmission of something nobody could see, until it was far too late. And yet in Beatrice's case, concealment led to scandal. Because her daughter-in-law, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, would marry into the Spanish royal family and bring hemophilia with her. The result wasn't just tragedy, it was national chaos, and it was never supposed to happen. 19. Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg. She was born royal, but not quite royal enough. Victoria Eugenie, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, daughter of Princess Beatrice, and yet always slightly on the margins of true power. Her early life was filled with courtly half-shadows. A royal name, but not a royal house. Privilege, but not primacy. Until one day she was chosen, not by fate, but by a king in search of a wife. And with that choice, she became Queen of Spain, and the unwitting carrier of a genetic time bomb. In 1906, she married King Alfonso XIV of Spain, a union orchestrated as both a romantic gesture and a diplomatic coup. British and Spanish royalty entwined, Protestant blood embraced by Catholic tradition, a modern queen consort imported from Windsor to Madrid. The Spanish public, skeptical from the start, eyed her coolly. She was foreign, Protestant at first, and above all, English. But none of that compared to the scandal that followed. From her mother, Princess Beatrice, Victoria Eugenie had inherited the hemophilia gene. Like her mother and grandmother before her, she showed no signs of illness herself. There was no test, no confirmation, no way to know for certain, until she began having children. Her first son, Alfonso, was born in 1907. Within months, it became clear something was wrong. Minor injuries caused major bleeding. The child bruised easily, bled often, and recovered slowly. The king, stunned, began asking questions. Doctors gave answers in cautious Latin. And quietly, the truth surfaced. The new queen had brought hemophilia into the Spanish royal bloodline. The king was furious. He accused Victoria Eugenie of ruining the family, of infecting the heirs to the throne. Their relationship, never particularly close, soured rapidly. Though they remained married in name, Alfonso took lovers, spent long periods away from court, and publicly distanced himself from his wife. She, in turn, devoted herself to her children and charitable work, enduring whispers in the palace and suspicion in the press. 2 of her sons were confirmed hemophiliacs. Both lived lives of cautious confinement. The eldest, Alfonso, was forced to renounce his rights to the throne in order to marry a commoner. The younger, Gonzalo, died at 19 from internal bleeding after a minor car accident. The Spanish public, already weary of monarchy, saw weakness, failure, a curse. Hemophilia became more than a medical condition. It became a political symbol. And Victoria Eugenie, though not to blame, bore the brunt of it. She withdrew from court life, lived largely abroad, and watched from afar as the monarchy she had married into collapsed into exile in 1931. She died in 1969, long after her husband, long after her kingdom, and long after the scandal faded from public memory. But the damage had been done. A gene passed in silence had cost her more than reputation. It had helped unravel a crown. And while Victoria Eugenie was exiled by genetics, the next royal was hidden altogether. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was different. A child who shook, stared, and couldn't be explained. His name was Prince John, and they kept him out of sight. 20. Prince John. He was the forgotten son, the 6th child of King George V and Queen Mary, and the one who quietly disappeared from public life before he ever had the chance to be remembered. Prince John, born in 1905, came into the world with all the expectations of royalty, until it became clear that he would never quite fit the frame built for him. At first he was simply described as high-spirited, or a little difficult. He was cheerful, energetic, full of nervous laughter and unpredictable movement. But as he grew, his behavior began to diverge further from his siblings. He had difficulty focusing. He startled easily. His speech developed slowly, and his social skills lagged behind. Eventually, seizures began. Today, we'd likely understand Prince John as a child with epilepsy and signs of autism, or a developmental disability. But in the early 20th century, there was no such language. Only silence, discomfort, and a deep royal instinct to protect the image of the family above all else. At age 4, John's seizures became frequent. His condition was labeled unstable and delicate. Soon after, he vanished from official royal duties entirely. There was no announcement, no medical explanation, no palace statement. He was simply moved. In 1917, he was relocated to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate. It was presented as a peaceful retreat, a place for quiet and recovery. In reality, it was a kind of soft exile, a royal solution for a child who could not be made to perform the expectations of monarchy. There, he lived with a nanny, a tutor, and a handful of attendants, far from the public eye and largely separated from his siblings. His parents visited occasionally but distantly. His older brother Edward, later Edward VIII, described him with barely veiled contempt as more of an animal than anything else. But those who actually lived with John described a very different boy, curious, kind, deeply attached to nature, and able to experience joy when not under pressure to conform. He died in 1919 at just 13 years old, following a severe seizure during the night. The public was informed after the fact. Most had never known there was a sixth son. His funeral was small, his headstone plain. The royal family expressed sorrow, but also, in their own words, relief. The burden was over. The secret could now rest. But Prince John never needed to be a secret. His life, though brief and tightly controlled, reveals an unspoken truth about monarchy, that there has never been space for those who don't fit the mold. Not if they shake, not if they wander, not if they cannot be managed. And while John was tucked away in the quiet countryside, the next child king would be kept in the spotlight even as his body began to vanish before their eyes. Edward VI, the longed-for Tudor heir, was dying by inches, and England insisted he was thriving. 21. Edward VI. He was the son they'd all been waiting for. The miracle boy, the Protestant prince, the child who would secure the Tudor dynasty once and for all. Edward VI, born in 1537 to Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, arrived amid national celebration and unbearable pressure. His mother died just days later, and from that moment forward, Edward's life belonged not to himself, but to the image of an unbreakable heir. But the image was a lie. Even as a boy, Edward was sickly, though this truth was kept behind thick palace walls. Contemporary accounts described him as clever, pious, bookish, traits that doubled as distractions. He was small, slight, pale, prone to illness and fatigue. He didn't ride well. He didn't eat much. His tutors noted his brilliance but also his frailty. Still, the narrative was maintained. The prince was healthy, vibrant, destined to lead a reformed England into golden light. That narrative collapsed in his teenage years. By the time Edward was 14, his health had taken a sharp decline. Historical consensus suggests he suffered from a progressive wasting illness, likely tuberculosis, though other theories have included pneumonia or chronic infections exacerbated by stress and overexertion. What's certain is that his body began to wither. He developed a persistent cough. His appetite dwindled. His skin turned ashen, his frame skeletal. But the royal press machine kept working. Bulletins described a brief fever, a passing chill, excellent spirits. While Edward shrank before his tutor's eyes, the public was told he was preparing to lead. Even in his final months, the deception continued. As he lay bedridden, racked with fever and unable to rise, official statements insisted he was recovering well. Foreign diplomats wrote home with more accurate assessments, that the king could barely speak, that his fingers were too weak to hold a pen, that he coughed blood and trembled constantly. But none of this was confirmed. The English court, desperate to project stability, clung to the fiction of vitality. Edward himself was aware. In rare, clear-eyed letters, he alluded to death. He began drafting a new line of succession, bypassing his Catholic half-sister Mary in favor of Lady Jane Grey. He wrote not like a child, but like someone rehearsing his own funeral. Because he was. He died in July 1553, at just 15 years old. The official cause of death was given in vague, evasive terms. Some blamed a fever. Others spoke of lung weakness. No post-mortem was conducted. No definitive diagnosis recorded. Just a brief reign, a closed coffin, and a country left scrambling to cover the gap between appearance and reality. And while Edward wasted away in secret, his grandfather, George V, carried his own illness with stoic silence, his lungs failing quietly behind palace walls, while a nation saluted a king they never knew was suffocating. 22. George V. He was the monarch who steadied Britain through World War, Revolution, and the crumbling of empires. George V, grandfather of Elizabeth II, is often remembered as the very image of restrained dignity, bearded, uniformed, dependable, boring, a king who seemed carved out of granite, immovable, unshakable, imperial. But even granite cracks. For much of his adult life, George V lived with chronic bronchitis and emphysema, the result of a lifelong addiction to cigarettes, a habit so intense that his doctors would later say it burned the lungs from the inside out. But you'd never know it from the portraits, or the speeches, or the photographs of him standing ramrod straight on palace balconies, waving to a nation that never saw him falter. And that was by design. George was raised under the rule of image. His father, Edward VII, had been flamboyant, indulgent, larger than life. George was the correction, austere, disciplined, perfectly proper. He understood, more than most, that a king's power lived in the illusion of strength. And so, when his lungs began to fail him in the 1920s, he simply didn't allow it to show. He coughed constantly. He wheezed when he stood too long. He became easily fatigued, struggled with breathing during formal occasions, and increasingly avoided long public events. Behind the scenes, he relied on oxygen tanks, delivered, hidden, and used discreetly. Court physicians devised ways to keep his condition quiet. Journalists who noticed the decline were offered subtle warnings. The king was tired, never sick. And the public, as always, believed what they were shown. Even during public appearances, when he had to rest frequently between duties, George projected solidity. He appeared on balconies for just minutes at a time, waving and retreating before anyone noticed the strain. Speeches were shortened. His voice, hoarse and breathless behind closed doors, was always firm when recorded. In private, he grew thinner, grayer, and more dependent on aides, not just for diplomacy, but for mobility. By the early 1930s, his health had sharply deteriorated. He suffered frequent bouts of bronchial infection, fluid in his lungs, and episodes of extreme fatigue. But his final illness in 1936 was once again cloaked in euphemism. Public statements described a chill and concerns about rest. In truth, he was being administered oxygen around the clock, drifting in and out of lucidity. When he died in January of that year, the public mourned a stable, reassuring figure. The press praised his duty, his strength, his loyalty to the nation. They did not mention the gasps between sentences, the whispered treatments, the slow suffocation behind velvet curtains. And so another monarch passed quietly under the weight of his own mythology, a king who breathed for a nation, even when he could barely breathe for himself. But long before George V swallowed silence for the sake of image, another king, Henry V, had watched his own face become a battlefield, as a mysterious skin disease slowly disfigured him while the court struggled to keep his crown and his body from falling apart. 23. Henry IV. Before the skin, there was the sword. Henry IV, the first of the Lancastrian kings, didn't inherit the crown. He seized it. A usurper by necessity, not divine right, he overthrew his cousin Richard II in 1399 and became king not because God willed it, but because Parliament tolerated it. That alone would have made his reign precarious. But then his body began to break down in ways no king could afford to show. By the early 1400s, Henry's face had begun to change. Chroniclers described a sudden, unsettling transformation. Sores, inflammation, scaly lesions, a creeping skin condition that disfigured his features and left him in pain. Some reports speak of a leprosy-like illness, though modern historians dismiss that diagnosis. Today, the most likely explanation is severe psoriasis, possibly compounded by lupus or another autoimmune disorder. But whatever the cause, the result was the same. The king's face was no longer suitable for display, and so it was hidden. For much of his reign, Henry became increasingly absent from public view. Ceremonies were shortened, appearances limited. When he did show himself, it was often behind heavy veils, elaborate robes, and ornate crowns, symbols meant to draw the eye away from what could no longer be disguised. Official portraits, of course, showed no such disfigurement. In them, he remained every inch the rightful monarch, clear-eyed, composed, symmetrical. But behind the scenes, his court was deeply unsettled. The king's physical decline raised uncomfortable questions. If divine favor had placed him on the throne, why was his face the one to suffer? If God approved of his kingship, why did he look more like a leper than a lord? The whispers began. Enemies seized on the transformation. Some claimed it was divine punishment for the deposition of Richard II. Others hinted at witchcraft or poison. Even allies found it difficult to explain. Chroniclers who supported Henry sidestepped the details, referring vaguely to illness, fevers, or holy suffering. Medical records, such as they were, described abscesses and eruptions, but never committed to a diagnosis. The mystery was politically safer than the truth. His health fluctuated for years. At times he seemed to recover, only to relapse. During long absences from court, rumors circulated that he had died, or worse, gone mad. But always he reappeared just in time, cloaked in ermine and rhetoric, reminding everyone that he was still king, even if his own skin no longer cooperated. He died in 1413, aged around 45, his body reportedly worn out by illness. No autopsy, no formal explanation. Just a quiet burial and a reign remembered for unrest, rebellion, and a face too complicated for history to properly record. And while Henry's affliction disfigured his face, his daughter-in-law Caroline of Ansbach would endure a hidden agony of her own, not in her skin but deep within her body, where a secret hernia grew over decades until it could no longer be kept behind lace and protocol. 24. Caroline of Ansbach. By all appearances, Queen Caroline of Ansbach was the picture of Hanoverian refinement, cultured, clever, politically astute, and always impeccably dressed. As queen consort to George II, she moved through court life with practiced elegance, a quiet force behind the throne. But behind her layered silks and sharp diplomacy, Caroline was enduring a physical torment that would go unspoken for years, a slow-growing, painful umbilical hernia. It wasn't an uncommon condition, especially for a woman who had borne 8 children. But in Caroline's case, the hernia became chronic and severe, causing ongoing pain, swelling, and eventually disfigurement. And yet, no one outside her closest circle knew, because Caroline, like so many royal women before her, understood the dangerous politics of weakness. In the 18th century, a queen was not expected to be strong. She was expected to be invulnerable in the ways that mattered. Graceful, fertile, composed. Illness was something to be endured privately, even more so when it affected the abdomen, a place already charged with the pressure of reproductive expectations. Caroline did what royal women had long been trained to do. She hid it. Her wardrobe helped. The wide panniers of Georgian court fashion disguised much more than just waistlines. They concealed bandages, braces, and the subtle signs of physical strain. Her posture grew more rigid with time, not just out of formality, but necessity. Pain was kept in check by silence, not absence. She continued to attend functions, host dignitaries, advise her husband, and appear publicly as though nothing were wrong. Behind the scenes, she was in increasing agony. As the hernia worsened, it began to interfere with her mobility. Walking became difficult. Standing for long periods, nearly impossible. She suffered intestinal discomfort, fatigue, and recurring infections. Still, she refused to give up her role. She was, in many ways, the backbone of George II's court, managing political relationships, soothing factional rivalries, and even acting as regent in his absence. Her influence was real, But her suffering was treated like a rumor no one dared confirm. Then, in November 1737, Caroline collapsed. She had concealed the hernia for too long. A piece of her bowel had become strangulated, a fatal complication that would require surgery. At the time, such a procedure was primitive, brutal, and extremely risky. Yet she consented, knowing it might be the only chance. The operation failed. In the days that followed, Caroline remained lucid, joking with doctors, even comforting her grieving husband. She died at age 54, leaving behind a legacy of strength wrapped in the trappings of modest invisibility. No monument commemorates her pain. No royal history lingers on the quiet resilience it took to rule while being slowly undone from within. But if Caroline concealed her suffering with composure, Anne Boleyn would face a different kind of scrutiny, not over her pain, but over her very anatomy. Whispered rumors of extra fingers and strange features that turned a queen into a cautionary tale. 25. Anne Boleyn. She was the queen who changed everything, and paid for it with her head. But long before her trial, before the accusations, before the scaffold, Anne Boleyn was already the subject of whispers. Not about her politics or her religion, but her body, specifically the parts of it that didn't quite conform to the image of a Tudor queen. The rumors began early, that she had a sixth finger, a mole on her neck, an elongated tooth, even a witch's mark. Physical anomalies that, in Tudor England, were more than just curiosities. They were signs, omens, proof, in the minds of some, that Anne wasn't just ambitious. She was unnatural. There's no definitive evidence that Anne had any significant deformities. But something was there, some subtle irregularity, enough for her enemies to seize upon. Contemporary descriptions mention a slight deformity of the nail on one of her fingers, possibly a small extra nail or malformed digit. One ambassador noted that she had a projecting tooth under her upper lip and described her complexion as swarthy. Another hinted at moles or marks on her neck and body, marks that in the 16th century were often seen as demonic. But these were not objective observations. They were political weapons. Anne was a threat from the start. She captivated Henry VIII not with docile charm, but with intellect, style, and refusal. She refused to become his mistress, refused to disappear, refused to accept less than a crown. In return, she was elevated and resented. Court rivals, foreign ambassadors, and devout Catholics saw her as a usurper, a seductress, even a heretic. Her body, therefore, became part of the narrative. When her downfall came in 1536, the gossip about her physical deformities escalated. Enemies painted her as both morally and physically corrupt, a queen with the devil's fingerprints on her skin. Accusations of adultery and treason were laced with references to unnatural traits. Her supposed extra finger became a symbol, not of difference, but of danger. And yet, every known portrait of Anne shows nothing unusual. Every personal account from those who supported her, ladies-in-waiting, close confidants, omits any mention of deformity. It's entirely possible that Anne had nothing more than a slight imperfection, exaggerated by the forces that wanted her gone. But it worked. The whispers served their purpose. By the time she was led to the scaffold, Anne was no longer a woman in the public imagination. She was a symbol of corruption, excess, and moral decay. Her alleged physical flaws were used to explain her fate, as if her body had been warning them all along. And while Anne's marks may have been mythologized, her stepdaughter Mary Verst would experience a far more public and far more haunting battle with her body, one that swelled with the promise of life, only to deliver emptiness again and again in full view of the nation. 26. Camilla and Charles's decades-long affair. Before she was queen, she was a scandal. Before he was king, he was a punchline. The relationship between Charles and Camilla, now legally and ceremonially sanctified, spent decades as one of the worst-kept secrets in royal history. Theirs was a love story that began before it was allowed, endured in the shadows, and eventually erupted into public disgrace. But for a very long time, it was also something else entirely, an institutional liability hidden beneath layers of silence, spin, and strategic denial. The story begins innocently enough. Charles met Camilla Shand in the early 1970s. They were close in age, socially well-matched, and reportedly fell for each other almost instantly. But timing, royal expectations, and aristocratic politics got in the way. Charles, a naval officer at the time, was deemed not yet ready to marry. And more importantly, Camilla wasn't considered appropriate wife material for a future king, not virginal enough, not aristocratic enough, not image-friendly. So while Charles was away, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a well-connected army officer. The palace breathed a sigh of relief. Crisis averted. But in reality, the affair between Charles and Camilla never truly ended. It simply changed shape. Throughout Charles's courtship and eventual marriage to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, Camilla remained a presence. Quiet, but constant. Charles insisted they were just friends. The palace reinforced that narrative with polite smiles and vague denials. Meanwhile, Diana, young, idealistic, and increasingly suspicious, saw the truth with startling clarity. They were always three in the marriage, she would later say in the infamous BBC Panorama interview. But long before that line broke the fourth wall of royal mythology, the affair had been carefully managed behind the scenes. The press was discouraged from digging. Camilla was kept out of sight. Royal aides played interference. It worked, for a while. By the early 1990s, the whole thing began to unravel. In 1992, Andrew Morton's bombshell book Diana, Her True Story, detailed the pain Diana experienced over Charles's ongoing relationship with Camilla. Then, in 1993, came the Camillagate tapes, a leaked recording of a phone call between Charles and Camilla that left the public and press stunned and, quite frankly, disgusted. The monarchy tried damage control. Charles admitted the affair had happened, but only after the marriage had irretrievably broken down. Camilla withdrew from public life. The Queen reportedly refused to even speak her name. But the tide had turned. The public, once enamored with the royal romance of Charles and Diana, now viewed the heir to the throne as morally compromised and emotionally tone-deaf. It took years, and Diana's tragic death, before the palace could begin the long, awkward project of rehabilitating Camilla's image. Even then, the effort was cautious. She didn't attend official royal events for years. When she and Charles finally married in 2027, Diana's secret interviews and recordings. Diana never had the luxury of discretion. From the moment her engagement to Prince Charles was announced, her life became a national obsession, monitored, mythologized, and manicured beyond recognition. But behind the tiaras and tabloid smiles, she was already doing something quietly radical, documenting her own truth. In the early 1990s, Diana began secretly recording her private thoughts, experiences, and emotional pain. The catalyst? A sense of suffocation. The institution had made it clear she was expected to smile, stay quiet, and uphold a version of events that bore no resemblance to her lived reality. And so she chose to speak. Not publicly at first, but privately, into microphones and into history. These recordings were facilitated by journalist Andrew Morton, who used them, without identifying his source at the time, to write Diana, Her True Story, published in 1992. The book detonated like a bomb inside Buckingham Palace. It portrayed Diana as a deeply unhappy woman trapped in a cold, calculating system. It revealed her eating disorders, her emotional distress, her suicidal ideation, and, most explosively, her knowledge of Charles and Camilla's ongoing relationship. The royal family denied everything. Aides scrambled. Morton was dismissed as sensationalist. But the truth was impossible to put back in the box. Diana had laced her own words through the pages, even if the public didn't yet know it. Eventually, the secret came out. The book had been based on recordings made with Diana's full knowledge and cooperation. It wasn't an unauthorized biography. It was her personal manifesto. But she didn't stop there. In 1995, Diana gave a now legendary televised interview to Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program. It was the first time a senior royal had spoken so candidly, so emotionally, and so directly to the public. She confirmed the affair. She spoke of her own infidelity. She talked openly about her struggle with mental health, and she made clear, in no uncertain terms, that she felt unprotected by the royal institution. The interview sent shockwaves through the palace and the public. It was also, as later investigations revealed, obtained through manipulation. Bashir had used falsified documents to gain Diana's trust, but the content of the interview was genuine, and it irreversibly altered how the public viewed the royal family. Afterward, Diana was effectively cut loose. She and Charles formally divorced in 1996. Her royal HRH title was stripped, but her voice had been heard and recorded. The monarchy, an institution built on silence and ceremony, had been outmaneuvered by a woman with a microphone. And the recordings she left behind would continue to shape her legacy long after her death. Because when history is controlled by those in power, truth becomes an act of rebellion. And Diana, for all her flaws and contradictions, made sure hers could not be buried. The next secret? It wasn't whispered into a microphone. It was shouted through slammed 28, Charles and Diana's miserable marriage. It began with a wave from the balcony, a fairy tale gown, and the ringing of wedding bells across a hopeful Britain. July 29, 1981. Charles and Diana, the perfect prince and the perfect bride. Or so everyone thought. What they were really witnessing was a state-managed illusion, an arrangement wrapped in tradition and crowned with denial. Behind the camera flashes, the marriage was cracking before it had even begun. Charles, 32, was under mounting pressure to marry. Diana, just 20, was chosen not only for her aristocratic background, but for her perceived pliability. She was young, charming, and, most importantly to the royal establishment, untouched by scandal. But no one seemed to ask if they were actually compatible. They weren't. Charles was still emotionally entangled with Camilla Parker Bowles, a relationship he had never truly let go of. Diana knew it. She even confronted Camilla about it, long before the public knew anything. That confrontation would later be immortalized in books and interviews, but at the time it was smoothed over by palace aides as teething problems in a royal marriage. The real problem? The marriage was never based on love. At least not mutual love. It was a dynastic necessity, engineered by tradition, not affection. From the honeymoon onward, the distance was obvious. Diana felt isolated and unwanted. Charles felt trapped and misunderstood. They were cast as leads in a romantic narrative neither of them believed in. Diana, thrust into the spotlight, began to buckle under the pressure. She was mobbed by photographers, dissected in tabloids, and criticized for everything from her fashion to her facial expressions. Charles, rather than protect her, seemed resentful of her instant popularity. She was called the People's Princess. He was called, well, often just the other one. By the late 1980s, their public appearances had become performances, polite, strained, and increasingly rare. Behind the scenes, the relationship had deteriorated into long stretches of cold silence and passive-aggressive warfare. Affairs were happening on both sides. Tensions spilled over into staff gossip, which spilled over into the press. The monarchy's solution? Deny everything. Keep smiling. Keep waving. In 1992, the same year Diana, Her True Story was published, Prime Minister John Major announced that Charles and Diana had officially separated. It was phrased carefully. amicably. Mutual respect. But everyone knew the truth. The marriage had been dead for years. By the time their divorce was finalized in 1996, the public had stopped asking what went wrong. They already knew. What had started as a royal union had become a cautionary tale about the cost of duty, the danger of emotional repression, and the illusion of royal perfection. And yet, even as their marriage publicly imploded, the monarchy clung to appearances, because the next truth was even more taboo. It wasn't about infidelity or dysfunction. It was about something the palace had always insisted wasn't possible for someone so admired. A private war waged in silence. In 29. Princess Diana's eating disorders. For years, the public watched her shrink, in gowns, in photographs, in footage replayed 1,000 times over. Princess Diana became thinner, more fragile, more doll-like. And no one said anything. Not officially, not in the press, certainly not in the palace. Because admitting that the Princess of Wales had an eating disorder would have required the royal family to admit something far worse, that their world, so gilded and guarded, could cause real suffering. But Diana was suffering, and she wasn't hiding it. In interviews, later recordings, and first-hand accounts, Diana revealed the extent of her battle with bulimia, a condition she said began shortly after her engagement to Charles. The pressure, the scrutiny, the coldness of palace life, it all compounded into a self-destructive coping mechanism that the monarchy neither acknowledged nor intervened in. At the time, bulimia was barely understood by the public, and even less by the institutions surrounding her. Within the palace, it was treated as an embarrassment, not an illness. Staff were told not to mention it. Family members, including Charles, reportedly dismissed it as attention-seeking. The result was that Diana was left to manage it on her own, which she did intermittently between photo ops and state dinners. The irony is brutal. The woman known for her beauty and grace was waging a secret war against her own body, a body that the monarchy was using as a symbol of perfection. And every time she appeared in public, thinner, paler, quieter, the system applauded her poise, rather than asking what it was costing her. Diana herself later spoke openly about it. In her 1995 Panorama interview, she said, "You inflict it upon yourself because your self-esteem is at a low ebb, and you don't think you're worthy or valuable." Her voice was calm, her words were searing. That one admission cracked open a conversation Britain had been avoiding. For the first time, a senior royal had publicly discussed mental health, not in vague terms, but with brutal honesty. And not as a public service campaign, but as lived experience. The palace? Silent again. They issued no statement, no initiative, just the usual hope that the news cycle would move on. But it didn't. Diana's openness about her eating disorder made her even more beloved by the public. Not because she was perfect, but because she was finally undeniably real. She wasn't a statue in a tiara. She was a young woman drowning in a world that demanded she never show weakness, and who chose to show it anyway. And yet, even as she lifted the veil on her suffering, another veil remained, one covering the parts of her life the monarchy worked even harder to conceal: her lovers, her private joys, her quiet rebellions. Not everything was tragic. Some of it was just forbidden. No one said anything, not officially, not in the press, certainly not in the palace, because admitting that the 30 Diana's secret lovers. For someone watched by the world, Diana had a remarkable ability to disappear, emotionally, romantically, even physically. Not from the cameras, of course. The cameras were constant, but from the narrative that the palace insisted upon, that she was a jilted princess, frozen in time, eternally heartbroken. What the royal script didn't account for was that Diana, long before she died, had begun rewriting herself, not just as a symbol of survival, but as a woman who dared to seek love on her own terms. And she did, more than once, more seriously than the palace ever wanted to admit. Throughout the 1990s, Diana was involved with several men, all of them deemed inappropriate by royal standards, which is to say, they were real people. Not dukes, not diplomats, not distant cousins from acceptable bloodlines. They were human, flawed, and in some cases, deeply ordinary, which made them dangerous in the eyes of the institution. One of the most serious was Dr. Hasnat Khan, a British Pakistani heart surgeon whom Diana met in 1995. Quiet, brilliant, and intensely private, Khan was everything the monarchy wasn't. Their relationship lasted nearly 2 years, hidden from the press, barely acknowledged by insiders, and deeply serious by Diana's own account. She described him as Mr. Wonderful. Friends later said she had considered converting to Islam to marry him, but the relationship was quietly suffocated by the pressures that surrounded her. Khan, wary of the media circus, reportedly ended things. Diana, never content with loneliness, moved on, this time more publicly. In the summer of 1997, she began a high-profile romance with Dodi Fayed, son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed. This one the world saw, on yachts, at restaurants, in grainy long-lens photographs splashed across front pages. The palace maintained silence. The tabloids foamed at the mouth, and speculation erupted. Was it real love? A summer fling? A provocation? We'll never fully know. Their relationship was still unfolding when both were killed in a car crash in Paris that August. Conspiracy theories bloomed almost immediately. Was it an accident? Was it orchestrated? Was the royal family involved? The questions multiplied, partly because of who Dodi was. A Muslim, a non-Brit, a name that would never have been welcomed into the House of Windsor. After Diana's death, the palace scrambled to reassert control over the narrative. Grief was allowed, but only within approved limits. Her private life, her lovers, her personal desires, her emotional rebellions, was quietly scrubbed in favor of sainthood. But the facts remained. Diana had fallen in love, more than once, and she had done so while under constant surveillance, legal pressure, and tabloid obsession. She tried to live like a normal woman in the most abnormal of circumstances, and the monarchy, instead of protecting her, often treated her affections like threats to be managed. In the end, her love life was neither fairy tale nor scandal. It was simply human, and that perhaps was what made it so unacceptable. But while Diana's romances caused embarrassment, 31. Royal finances and offshore investments. The British monarchy is many things: symbolic, ceremonial, historical. But it's also a financial institution, flush with centuries of inherited wealth, taxpayer subsidies, and mysterious streams of private income. For most of modern history, the inner workings of royal finances have remained shrouded in polite vagueness: the sovereign grant, the duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster, the crown estate. The public was told that the system was balanced, mutually beneficial, tradition-bound, all very above board. And then came the leaks. In 2017, the Paradise Papers, a massive leak of documents related to offshore investments, exposed that millions of pounds from the Queen's private estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, had been invested in offshore tax havens, including the Cayman Islands and Bermuda. Among the investments? A rent-to-own furniture company accused of exploiting poor British families. The irony practically wrote itself. The monarchy issued a carefully worded statement. The investments, it said, were legal. They were made by financial managers without the Queen's direct knowledge. And while technically accurate, the damage was already done. The perception of the royal family as financially insulated and morally aloof was reinforced, not by enemies, but by spreadsheets. This wasn't the first time royal finances had come under scrutiny. Decades earlier, public unease was already building over how much the royal household cost the taxpayer. The sovereign grant, essentially an annual payment from the government to cover the monarchy's official expenses, was repeatedly defended as a bargain. But critics noted that the monarchy's total wealth, including properties, art, land, and private investments, remained immune to serious oversight. The crown estate alone generates billions in revenue, which, technically, goes to the government. But in exchange, the monarchy receives a fixed percentage. Meanwhile, the Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster, considered private estates, operate as sprawling portfolios with minimal transparency. And yet, asking questions about royal money remains taboo. Parliamentary debates are rare. Journalistic investigations are often stonewalled. FOI, Freedom of Information, requests related to the monarchy are blocked by special exemptions. The royal family is, in effect, the least scrutinized wealthy institution in Britain. Why? Because the monarchy isn't just rich, it's sacred. And sacredness, as any accountant will tell you, is a great way to avoid an audit. But the offshore revelations were different. They weren't hypothetical or ideological. They were specific, traceable, embarrassing. And for a brief moment, they punctured the myth of royal neutrality. The Queen, head of state, face of charity, symbolic mother of the nation, was now also a stakeholder in companies that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. The monarchy survived the scandal, as it always does. No laws were broken, no one resigned. But the story left a permanent stain. 32. Queen Anne's severe health problems. She ruled over the unification of England and Scotland, survived bitter political factions, and outlived every one of her children. Queen Anne, last of the Stuarts, first sovereign of Great Britain, spent her reign preserving a kingdom and quietly losing a family. While history remembers her as a devout, rotund monarch with a tragic face, what the records downplay, or neatly abbreviate, is the relentless, almost unimaginable scope of her personal suffering. Queen Anne experienced at least 17 pregnancies. 17. Of those, only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy. He died at age 11. The rest were a harrowing mix of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died within days or weeks. 17 pregnancies, 0 adult heirs. The monarchy never said much about this. The official line was always poor health or complications. But in truth, Anne's body became a battlefield, one the crown was desperate to ignore, because to confront it would be to acknowledge the one thing no royal institution can comfortably admit, that even queens can be biologically unlucky. Anne suffered from chronic illness for most of her life. Historians believe she had lupus, or possibly an autoimmune disorder that contributed to her reproductive struggles and left her often confined to bed. She was so plagued by gout and other ailments that she had to be carried in a sedan chair to parliamentary sessions. Her body swelled. Her vision faded. Her mobility diminished. And yet, she governed. Her personal letters reveal a woman not just in physical pain, but in emotional torment. Each pregnancy was not just hope, it was pressure. The court waited, the country waited. The succession depended on it. She was not just expected to produce an heir, she was expected to redeem a bloodline teetering on the brink of extinction. Every time she failed, silence followed. Not sympathy, not pause, just silence. There were no state funerals for her children, no official mourning periods. The deaths of royal infants were treated as unfortunate but peripheral. The kingdom moved on, even when Anne couldn't. She mourned in private. She wrote of her unspeakable grief, and she kept trying. When her son William died in 1700, the crown was thrown into panic. Parliament passed the Act of Settlement to ensure a Protestant succession, bypassing dozens of Catholic claimants. The future of the monarchy, and of Britain itself, had to be legally rewritten around Anne's empty nursery. She died in 1714, obese, chronically ill, and alone. Her body bore the weight of dynastic desperation. Her legacy, often reduced to her inability to do the one thing that mattered most to the crown: produce a living heir. In a monarchy obsessed with lineage, Anne became a cautionary tale, a symbol of maternal failure through no fault of her own, and a reminder that the crown's reverence for family is always conditional. And if Anne's tragedy was framed as misfortune, the next royal secret would be framed as omission, a set of illegitimate children that no one officially confirmed, but everyone suspected. Children born of a king's pleasure, erased by his dignity. 11. The rest were a harrowing mix of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died within days or weeks. 17 pregnancies, 0 adult heirs. The monarchy never said much about this. The official line was always poor health or complications. But in truth, Anne's body became a battlefield, one the crown was desperate to ignore, because to confront it would be to acknowledge the one thing no royal institution can comfortably admit: that even queens can be biologically unlucky. Anne suffered from chronic illness for most of her life. Historians believe she had lupus. 33. Charles I's rumored illegitimate children. Charles I is remembered for many things: his divine right absolutism, his showdown with Parliament, and his eventual execution in 1649. He is less frequently remembered for his private life, partly because he crafted it that way. Unlike his more flamboyant descendants, Charles I went to great lengths to present himself as a devoted husband and pious king. And, for the most part, history has granted him that image. But under the surface, rumors persisted. Quiet ones, speculative, never officially confirmed, but never quite going away. Chief among them, that Charles III fathered illegitimate children, and that the crown worked hard to suppress any trace of them. The official story is that Charles was deeply devoted to his wife, Henrietta Maria of France. Their relationship was genuine, if politically fraught. She was Catholic, which caused considerable unrest in a staunchly Protestant England. But within court circles, whispers of affairs occasionally surfaced, often centered around Charles's time as a young prince before his marriage. There's no smoking gun, no acknowledged bastards raised to dukedoms like Charles II would later bestow. But there are tantalizing hints. Letters referring to unnamed wards receiving generous stipends. Noble families who rose suddenly in influence with no clear political explanation. Quiet references in foreign correspondence to the king's child being fostered abroad. Even more suspicious is how completely the topic was avoided in official documents. In an era where royal mistresses and illegitimate offspring were more common than court musicians, the complete absence of acknowledgement raises eyebrows. Was Charles uniquely virtuous? Or was his image so carefully managed, even posthumously, that any evidence of indiscretion was simply erased? The stakes were unusually high for Charles. His legitimacy as king was constantly under attack, not just by Parliament, but by Protestant hardliners who viewed his French Catholic queen with suspicion. To admit to an illegitimate child would have been more than a moral blemish. It would have been political suicide. A hypocritical betrayal of the very divine order he claimed gave him the right to rule. After his execution, his enemies had no shortage of things to say about his arrogance, his governance, and his religious compromises. And yet, the topic of illegitimate children remained curiously untouched, which only deepens the mystery. If they had existed, and if they had been known, wouldn't the parliamentarians have weaponized the revelation? Or did even they agree to keep the private affairs of the monarchy out of political warfare? It remains one of those royal questions historians continue to circle, not because it would dramatically rewrite the lineage, but because of what it would reveal about how the monarchy curated its narrative. If Charles I had illegitimate children, they weren't threats to the throne, they were threats to the myth. And myths in the royal world are far more valuable than facts. The next king, however, wouldn't be so careful. His secrets wouldn't just come with whispers, they'd come with exile, rebellion, and a secret religious agenda that nearly toppled the crown. Among them, that Charles III fathered illegitimate children, and that the crown worked hard to suppress any trace of them. The official story is that Charles was deeply devoted to his wife, Henrietta Maria of France. Their relationship was genuine, if politically fraught. She was Catholic, which caused considerable unrest in a staunchly Protestant England. But within court circles, whispers of affairs occasionally surfaced, often centered around Charles's time as a young prince before his marriage. There's no smoking gun, no acknowledged bastards raised to dukedoms like Charles II would later bestow. But there are tantalizing hints. Letters referring to unnamed wards receiving generous stipends. Noble families who rose suddenly